Now introduce Oliver Leatham from Certara, who is going to talk about the topic being opportunities for accelerated access. So over to you, Oliver, and thank you. If you want to put your slides on.
Sure, thank you very much, Navin. Just sharing my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, thank you. Great.
Okay, excellent. So hi, everybody. My name is Oliver Leatham. I'm based here in the UK, and I'm a vice president for Certara. One of the things we focus on here in Certara is opportunities for accelerated access to new medicines. It's a key theme in our business, but I think also never before have we needed this more, considering COVID-19 last year and the accelerated launch of the vaccines, which we were fortunate to work on. Some of the key never before really in rare diseases, gene therapy and curative therapies, have we seen so many new, novel, exciting products coming to market. And we've had to find new novel ways to help navigate complex HTA systems and learn from examples of best practice, what other people have done well, to be able to help understand better how to do this in the real world. But first of all, I think companies really aren't necessarily set up to do this traditionally. We often do things in several different ways. We have our clinical part of our organization. Sometimes HTA parts of the organization are separate to health economics and market access. And we really need to think about new ways of demonstrating value post-launch and thinking about this earlier and earlier in the product development cycle. By doing this, we benefit both health systems, manufacturers, and patients. So it's really a win-win-win. And there's different ways to do this. We can tie this to performance. We can introduce things like financial caps to limit the overall spend to the health system. And we can look at other things such as value by indication. So currently, as well as manufacturers, health systems are not really set up to deal with the high price of novel drugs, potentially high upfront costs of advanced therapy, medicinal products, ATMPs, for example, with high manufacturing costs and low patient numbers, are starting to demand higher product prices. And of course, we need to ensure we get a fair return on investment. But health systems with annual budgets aren't really set up to manage this. So we need to work well with and engage early with health systems and regulatory agencies and payers to help them manage their budgets better, and possibly even help reshape the commissioning system itself. So what are some of the challenges for payers? I always think of payers like the finance director in my business. So I hope he's not listening. Their job is to say no to most things that we ask of them, and our job is to convince them to say yes. Of course, they need to manage their budgets and ensure that money is spent effectively and efficiently on the things that gain the most value. But our job is to try to convince them that the products that we have are the highest value products and are going to help change people's quality of life, but also in doing so, reduce the strain on their budgets. But there's several levels of uncertainty that we have to help them deal with. For example, for novel therapies, we're often bringing things to market with surrogate endpoints or a lack of comparative efficacy because sometimes there's nothing to compare to. Product demand for new medicines is often higher than anticipated, so they may launch in a priori patient subpopulation. But then when we try to expand this to other patient groups, some of this is often done off license, and that's a fear for payers that would expand access too much too soon and bust the budgets. Cost density also doesn't fit with budgets. As I mentioned, the payers often work on an annual budget system. And what often happens when a new product comes to market is there's a huge demand for this product in the first year or the first few years. And that's often where the price is higher. So we have to also help manage access and spread the costs in some ways. And cost effectiveness at launch often can't be demonstrated. Again, sometimes there's nothing to compare it to, or the data just isn't strong enough. So these are all easy pushbacks from payers that we have to help circumnavigate, and we have to help to be able to demonstrate some of this value earlier and earlier on in the process. So before we learn from some good examples of where things have gone well, let's look at some examples of where things haven't necessarily worked so well in the past. I don't know if everybody's aware of the example of Glybera. This was this product that gained EMA approval and HTA approval for lipoprotein lipase deficiency, an ultra orphan indication with very few products. The product was launched with an over 1 million euros price tag per patient, but it had limited data at launch, surrogate endpoints. It didn't really, I think, demonstrate full value beyond the HTA to the payers. And over 5 years, there was only one patient who was actually prescribed this drug, and eventually the product had to be pulled. So was there something that the company could have done differently in terms of demonstrating this value earlier, in terms of working more closely with health systems to get the product to more patients and being able to gain the right type of data that would reassure payers that this was a good bet? Another example was Repatha in hypercholesterolemia. This gained regulatory approval on a clinical trial, again on a surrogate endpoint for reducing LDL-C levels, low density lipoprotein levels of cholesterol in the body. The data was sufficient for HTA approval, but the payer said, so what? What does this actually mean to us? Why would we reimburse this? What are you going to do in the real world? What about reduction in MIs, strokes, and hospitalizations due to cardiovascular events? So the company went back and it looked retrospectively at this data, and it was able to realize that it did actually reduce MI, stroke, and cardiovascular events. And the company also did two things. One is they guaranteed the collection of this data, and two, they put a risk share agreement around this, saying if they were unable to collect this data, they would not charge the health systems for it. But they lost a lot of time in market in doing so. So what are we doing? What are we learning? And how are we thinking differently about these things? Well, three main pathways have emerged in recent times. The first is a finance-based type pathway, which aims to help contain costs and manage affordability for payers. At a patient level, this may involve things like giving 3 initial treatment, such as they did with Cimzia in rheumatoid arthritis, where they gave 3 months, 3. You could call it a try before you buy type approach. And at a population level, where you might look to have price volume agreements, or to introduce utilization or expenditure caps so you don't go above a certain budget. There's performance-based agreements, which Mercedes has already touched on, outcomes-based agreements, where, again, you manage uncertainties by guaranteeing a certain type of data collection to guarantee your product claims in the real world. The coverage here is tied to outcomes or payment according to how a product performs, known as payment by results. And finally, service-based agreements, where we give added value to a health system, things like provided nurse care, patient management programs, improving adherence. All these things are ways of adding value and helping to reassure payers that we are willing to take a share of the risk. So out of these pathways, 4 key models really have emerged over recent years, and there's a few others that I'm also going to touch on today. The first is a subscription-based model, where you guarantee a certain amount of payment over a number of years for a product, and the manufacturer guarantees often unlimited access to that product for as many patients that need it. The second is the outcomes-based payment models, which we've touched on already, and Mercedes has, and we've also talked about quite a bit in this conference, and I'll give some examples too soon. But where a medicine's price is linked to the actual performance of the product in the real world, sometimes in terms of reduced hospitalizations, for example, things that you can usually measure economically and quantify in a model. There's indication and combination based pricing. This has been very difficult to achieve, particularly if you come in with an indication on a lower price and try to increase it. This is often not something that's been successful in the past, but it's certainly something that people are looking at, particularly as we bring in new novel therapies, for example, in immunotherapy, which may have multiple uses, multiple indications. So I think there's still a place for this, but it's been very difficult to do. The way this has often been achieved recently is to come in with the highest price for the first indication, and then to discount for future indications. And then financial based contracts, which are more simple to implement, often dealing with price volume agreements or payment caps or just simple discounts. But you could ask the question, is this really guaranteeing the true value of your product? Would you be better off backing your product's performance in the real world and asking maybe for a little bit more? So there has been a rise in acceptance of these types of models. Speaking to a French payer recently, they said the French system was one of the first to start outcomes-based contracting. We worked on a product called Xolair in acute exacerbations of asthma, where they tied a risk-sharing agreement for looking at about 700 patients across a number of hospitals and demonstrated reduced hospitalizations due to acute exacerbations using this product, and the product was reassessed and was able to retain the price premium that was granted to them by HAS. The system stalled for a while with changing governments, but it's now in a good place again. And one of the great things about the French system is that it's got excellent patient level data, so it's very easy to track the performance of a product in the real world. My colleague Nadia is going to talk a little bit more about the SNDS database a little bit more today. In Germany, German payers I spoke to recently also said that we will focus on the particularly important medicines whose effects can be measured relatively easily and unambiguously. So outcomes that we can generate which actually mean something and can be quantified. They can't push complexity of measuring and classifying success or data transfer into the realms of the unquantifiable. So economically quantifiable outcomes are absolutely important. And the GBA is also calling for real world evidence protocols at launch to allow for a reassessment a little bit further down the line. So let's look at some real examples of success. Kymriah with Novartis and Yescarta are two fantastic examples of where products have helped deal with payers' uncertainties. Firstly, the lack of data at launch, concerns around price were easy pushbacks, I think, for payers, but also for the regulatory agency, NICE. So they addressed this in three ways. One was going to the Cancer Drug Fund to ensure that there was budget available for the products. These are the first CAR T therapies to be successfully commissioned. Secondly, they put in place a confidential discount. And thirdly, they agreed a commitment to real-world data collection, which also will involve a price reassessment as early as 2023. I think this is an excellent example of how agencies and manufacturers can work closely together to bring products to patients who really need them the most. There's three key learnings, I think, from these examples. The first is the multiple stakeholder engagement, working with, in this case, the EMA, NICE, and the Cancer Drug Fund. Early dialogue and collaboration with these authorities around managed entry agreements and trying to find the right fit for the product that achieves that value demonstration that's necessary, but also backs the product's performance in the real world. And then ensuring, for example, through engagement with the Cancer Drug Fund, that funding is in place and ready to go once the products are launched. An example of how you can prepare payers and budgets for a new product launch is with Bluebird Bio's Zynteglo. They worked very closely with the German sickness funds to ensure that budgets were available come launch. And they'd already agreed managed entry agreement for the product once it was approved in market. They also put in place annuity-based payments, which could be spread over 5 years, and performance-based agreements, which link to annual payments, which relate to clinical outcomes. 3 learnings from this one is that multiple types of managed entry agreements can be combined to create a single model to help address payers' uncertainties. This is why I think bringing different things to the table to these discussions is really key, and something you can do early on if you engage payers in good time. Performance-based agreements also can help satisfy the use of clinical endpoints post-marketing, and help address payers' uncertainties by looking at extrapolating and extending studies, or looking at real-world data performance, and positively engaging the payers and putting these financial agreements in place early shows that you're willing to take a share of the risk. NHS England, and I'm sure everybody knows about Netflix. I'm sure everyone's been using a bit of Netflix during lockdown. I know I have. NHS England and Vertex, I think, is a great example of this in cystic fibrosis. This is a portfolio subscription-based model where you basically, they get NHS guaranteed to pay £1 billion over 10 years for a product. But they would, the company guaranteed access to all 3 products in their portfolio. So Orkambi, Simkevi, and Kalydeco. So, and there's no cap on patient numbers. So the idea was that 5,000 plus patients would receive access to these products, and the company worked to ensure there was a flexible commercial mechanism for payment that would ensure continued access to these programs. There's also working with NHS England allowed the company to circumnavigate NICE and to bring the product to market and to patients who really needed it quicker.
2 minutes, Oliver.
Thank you. So what do manufacturers need to do in order to ensure these MEAs work, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of them? Well, IAAs, or innovative agreements, really allow us to expand access opportunities by helping to address payers' concerns earlier. They allow us sometimes to put compatibility in place for future indication launch, and it also allows us to generate real-world evidence. For example, if we launch in a market with data strong, such as France or the Nordics, we can then use this data from the early launch to provide value in other markets. Some of the disadvantages that these things can be complicated and timely to put in place, and they can also be costly for a company, and failure to deliver on these commitments is also key. So I think having good data extrapolation, understanding what those health economics look like early, is really important. One final case study is old Jensema. This is completely novel, where Novartis agreed a one-off payment for a 10-year treatment of a product. They worked very closely with the payers to offer 5-year payment offerings and also outcomes-based agreements. Again, this bypassed NICE by agreeing this deal. And this is a very rare disease, limited evidence, but I think it's an example of what can be done if you collaborate well with the agencies up front. And it's yet to be seen whether this type of deal can be replicated.
Oliver, we're going to jump off, so last comments, please, if you don't mind.
Sure, this is the last slide. So really, the key things here are, being able to define value early, to be able to work with health systems to demonstrate value and affordability, to be able to generate real-world evidence, and for companies to be willing to take some share of this risk. And I think all these models, the outcomes-based agreements, Netflix, the one-day model, and this early engagement with payers and HTAs are really the way forward. And it's really up to companies to be able to and willing to put their money where their mouth is with some of these deals. So thank you very much, and happy to take any questions.
We run out of time, unfortunately, Oliver, but thank you very much. You're part of the panel, and if anybody has any questions, please write them on the swap card, and Oliver will be happy to respond to them. Or if you're attending the panel, obviously we can chase him on any questions you may have. All right, with that, Oliver, thank you very much. I found that interesting, and I'd like to follow up with some of the stuff you presented, but the case studies are fantastic. We always need to learn from what has worked, what hasn't worked, and that's well presented. So thank you. With that, thank you, both speakers, and thank you, attendees. If you're attending the panel, we'll see you there. Bye-bye.